So a question for Daniel. What you saw as the role of both shareholders and corporate investors in driving this kind of change, and how can you get it on, if they have an important role to play, then how can you get it on their agendas as well?
I don't have an answer to that, but I would first go to that speech given by Andy Haldane, because it really, I literally read it last week, and I'm not an expert in this area at all, but it really enlightened me as to the different pieces of legislation in place, the different, and it's very subtle, the difference in influence that the different players and different stakeholders have based on the legislation that's developed over the last 100 plus years, and how all those relationships work. And it's a very, I don't think there's going to be an easy answer to it at all, but yeah, fundamentally, interestingly, the conversations around insurance and what role the insurance sector can play, for me, I immediately thought, what are their interests? What are their governance structures? Obviously, they have an interest in long-term, particularly the reinsurance company and long-term interests, but ultimately, are their interests aligned with the interests of the wider population? I don't know. But for some reason, we've developed into this situation where we have all these governance structures which aren't aligned with that long-term impact, and we need to figure out how to rejig that. Sorry, it doesn't really answer your question, but...
Thanks. Jim?
It's interesting to see the migration into cities, and there've been projections made about what percentage of the world's population is going to be in cities in the future. Can you see a reversal of that process based on the quality of life in cities? For rich people there could be a quality of life, but for other people there can't. Could you see a reversal where people will migrate outwards again into the countryside and be freer rather than in cities? Could you see a reversal of that process?
Is that to me?
Well, anybody, yeah.
Sorry.
I'm happy to say that. I think you could see that, and that happens all the time. London's population is growing, but it's not solely growing because people are coming in. People are coming in, other people are moving out most often to the wider southeast. Some people are moving a bit further afield. So, that goes on more or less as we speak. I suppose it's the balance that, more people are coming in. London's a slightly different example to most of the rest of the UK in that it does attract quite a lot of international migration. And part of the answer to that is that it also brings to the city people who are at the time of their life where they're going to have children. So there is actually quite a lot of natural growth within the population. It's probably, the sort of the urbanisation effect has been going on really for a couple of thousand years. And I would suggest that the sort of the de-urbanisation that we saw after the Second World War maybe was a bit of a blip, to quite an extent driven by private motor vehicles. Certainly this country and in the United States. So maybe the sort of wholesale change is unlikely, but you never quite know just how technology might change. Supposing we've all got the sort of technology to do remote working, some of us use it from time to time, but we still have this natural sort of human instinct to concentrate in groups and in cities. Just to throw one thing in, I can't quite remember the reference, but there's certainly a bit of research that shows because birth rates are declining, and the urban population in more developed economies has a much lower birth rate than the sort of less developed countries, and we're going to have more of those sort of urbanised areas. I've certainly seen some bits of research that show the population trends that we saw earlier up to about 2050 levelling off, and in fact by the end of the century starting to drop. So world population peaking at around 10, maybe 11 billion, and then dropping back down, which starts to ask some of those other difficult questions. The Detroit example, how do you run a city that's got too much infrastructure and capacity, well, it ruins you basically. So, you know, there are things to be wary of in the long term. Excuse me.
Can I mean,
Thank you.
if we think about why people move to cities, people generally move to cities because of economic benefit. I mean, looking internationally, at Sao Paulo example, you know, there's just not enough housing yet. The economic activity in that city is drawing people still, even though there's no housing for them. So they're setting up huge favelas, and I can't see that economic draw reversing. So I think we will just see that growth of cities. And especially with the mechanisation of agriculture, actually the ability to sustain economic life in rural areas will only reduce over time. So I can only see cities growing bigger.
Well, it's maybe a comment and then a little question for Daniel. Thank you very much. It's an excellent presentation, and also encouraging that you see this trend that in the past, environment was something that government have invest heavily, and that's money thrown down the drain. From that philosophy, now with all this development of technology, this is a challenge. I have analyzed 100 FTSE companies. I couldn't see any one of them which would not benefit by investing in their own resilience as a high priority. They will get much better return than investing in gold mine in Chile or whatever. So I would very much like to you, are you ready to go from where you are now to this concept that any corporation in the world, big one, L'Oreal, for example, we are working a lot with L'Oreal and Siemens, they can make huge benefit by investing not in saving planets, it's business incentive. They make big money. At the same time, they're saving a lot of energy, water, whatever, creating nice environment, social housing. So that is, the question is, are you ready to go for the next step? You are at the moment kind of, does it work still? Do we have all the matrices, the indicators? Yes, we do. We've developed them, and there's technology in place. And we will demonstrate. The World Bank building in Paris, we retrofitted. After repaying back 2 years, they're now saving 40% of energy, just one single building. And I don't see any building in the city in London or anywhere else in the world should follow the same route. Maybe not all of them would be that easy, but we've seen examples, excellent example, which it does work.
I think there are obviously lots of instances where there is already a business case for doing something, but as I mentioned, the Design for Future Climate programme really resoundingly demonstrated that there isn't a business case for changing buildings and adapting them to future climate. Because at the end of the day, in the case of heat stress, you can just whack an air conditioning unit in it, and because of the price of energy at the moment, it doesn't stack up to do anything else. So whilst there are, changing light bulbs, for example, the efficiencies are there, I think it kind of depends on which sector you're looking at. So in urban development planning, particularly in this country, we have publicly floated companies who deliver the vast majority of the housing in this country. It's very different from over in the continent. There are, Austria purportedly, 80% of their new housing comes from custom build or self-build, for example. So there are different interests at play. And I'm not suggesting for one moment that to dismiss, that the volume house builder can't have a role at all. They have to. They are a major delivery of housing in this country, and so have to be part of the solution. But given that they have 5-year business planning time horizons, then, and I've had this conversation with someone from the Home Builders Federation, a senior guy from the HBF said, health and sustainability is not our problem. And he's absolutely right, it's not their problem. They are not responsible for long-term health and sustainability. So until you have those in control of urban development who take responsibility for long-term health and sustainability, I don't see that there will be any change. But in terms of being ready for it, if it does, bring it on. Fantastic.
Thank you. Elaine Toogood from the Concrete Centre. So I'm an architect, and the point about HBF and the housing, I think, is a very pertinent one. I think there's a lot of analogies to be thought about in terms of thinking about resilience and thinking about the recent changes in way that in the construction industry have been thinking about thermal performance. And on the hand, one could say, well, you know, we're not responsible for sustainability, but actually they are responsible for thermal performance. They have a requirement to do it under changed regulation. Clearly a fundamental part of underpinning what's going to make anybody do it. I think what's very different about resilience and the business case for resilience is that actually it does make very good business sense for those who are protecting their own asset, which means it's actually then fundamentally down to procurement. And as you said, housing within the UK, very much a lot of it is speculative. But there are some very enlightened clients already within the UK. The Co-op headquarters in Manchester, building designed for 2080. Joseph Rowntree, lots of interesting work going on there. The Oxford and Cambridge universities, buildings that are designed for a 100-year life. And we've been running some recent projects illustrating how actually when people have an interest in protecting their asset, they will do it because it makes good business sense. And actually, so I think that is all exactly the same arguments that everybody was having about thermal performance and reducing carbon in buildings. And that has changed quite considerably over the last 10 years. So I don't think we should be, I think we should be quite optimistic about that. And I wonder what your thoughts on that was.
Me? So I completely agree. I think this concept of ownership is very pertinent. I went to a conference recently where this came up, and it's made me think, or sort of think in new lights around this issue of ownership. But ownership around assets and over the long term, I think, is absolutely fundamental, because, as you say, you're not going to have people responding to those challenges unless there is that inherent interest in the long-term viability of whatever it is. And forgive me, I did end up in my presentation. I think optimism is absolutely critical. If we're not optimistic, then what's the point?
I think also you alluded to Mark Carney, and by the time we get around to do something, it's going to be too late. And I think by the time that business case becomes self-evident, people do start acting out of self-interest because they see the environment around them or the built environment changing to a point where it's untenable. That's going to be too late, isn't it? That's why we've got to start communicating and getting the message out there now and building business cases now, because otherwise it will be too late and we'll miss the boat and everyone will suffer as a result.
Is there an aspect of safety to this? We all know everybody jumps with health and safety. It's something that we're very good at responding to within the UK. And actually, it struck me when I was at an event that we organised recently. We were looking at every single issue to do with resilience, and there is a safety angle on every single part of that. Overheating, floods, fire. And actually the corporate social responsibility of the well-being and the duty that they have as not just protecting assets and buildings, but protecting employees. That's a way in, I would have thought. And certainly within our business of minerals, that's certainly people beginning to think about resilience of businesses as being just a corporate part, an important part of just maintaining your own long-term business strategy.
I think, again, it comes back to the decisions and the evidence that's available for those making the decisions, because at the end of the day, they have to report to their board, and they have to demonstrate to their board that they're making the right decisions. And in some cases, you might have a Marks and Spencers like a Sir Stuart Rose, who you have leaders who had conversations with Al Gore, and they've decided that they're actually going to take their business in a different direction, for example. And you could apply that to certain examples within the volume house building industry. But at the end of the day, I think most of the vast majority are going to require evidence in order to make that justification to their board. And at the end of the day, it has to be financial, I think. I think there is a very strong moral argument. There's all sorts of other arguments that can play, and they all have to come into the mix. The finance can only ever be a part of it, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, and so it's always probabilistic. There's always issues around credibility. So, yeah, it needs both angles.
Okay.
Thanks. Join with me in thanking the speakers for their...